E. Moore is named after Elizabeth Moore. Elizabeth Moore was the headmistress of Woodburn Academy, the first higher education institution in West Virginia for women. They built it and named it after Mrs. Moore because of her work for women's education in the state. But sadly, she passed away 1 year before it was completed and never got to set foot inside. For that reason, they say that Mrs. Moore's ghost haunts that building, and she is still there protecting the women of the university. One time there was a guy and a girl swimming in the basement of the building in the pool, and they looked up and Mrs. Moore was floating over the water next to them. And the reason is because Mrs. Moore was actually chaperoning the girl while she was on the date with a boy, because you never leave a girl alone with a boy on a date. There's also been people who are female staffers are the ones who regularly interact with her. She usually doesn't interact with men. One lady in particular was sitting at her desk and suddenly all the phone lights lit up, and in the distance across the balcony she saw Mrs. Moore walking away from her, and as she walked past the windows the curtains would pull out flat and straight. And then as Mrs. Moore got to the end and disappeared, the curtains all fell back against the glass. And some people say, well, why would she have done that? And I said, well, she was making sure the building looked nice, and she was actually ironing the curtains. Another thing that she's known to do is protect her own interest in the building. One time in history, back in the 70s, I believe, someone thought it would be a good idea to take Mrs. Moore's portrait and put it in storage. And Mrs. Moore did not like that. So the next day they came in and her portrait was back on the nail and the guy was down beneath her. So they did a test and they took Mrs. Moore's portrait off and locked it in a closet and came back in. And they found Mrs. Moore had taken her picture out of the closet that had been locked, hung her picture back on the wall, and put the other guy on the floor. And the university has not tried to move that picture since that happened. One lady who was working at the front desk, actually, she was right there where we were, and the staircase, she watched Mrs. Moore start at the bottom of the staircase. She just appeared, and as she climbed the staircase, she vanished from her head to her shoulders to her waist, down to her shoes. When she got right to the top of the staircase, nothing was left of her but her shoes, and they winked out, and that was it. But random things happen like that. Just from the amount of stories that I know about her, and I know that there have been probably hundreds of others, I figure it has been hundreds, if not thousands, of interactions that she's had in that building with people and objects and things. Also, I find that she spent her entire life educating women, and making sure that women got a fair shake, and making sure that women always had a place to study, a place to be. And I think that was really important to her life, and I think because it was so important in her life, she finds it very important in her death. So her afterlife is basically a mission to continue what she already did. So I think as long as that building is there, Elizabeth's going to be around.